Hi everyone, in this Excel tutorial we're going to cover charts right from the basics. So we're going to take a bar chart and look at all the individual components. So this tutorial is really handy for somebody who is just coming into learning Microsoft Excel and wants to know about how to make charts. So in order to make a chart, you really need to know what are the components of a chart. So that's what we're going to cover. Now, charts are basically a really essential feature of Microsoft Excel. And in essence, they are graphical representations of data. Now, you can have lots of different types of charts, and charts can be stored within a spreadsheet, more specifically the worksheets, or a chart sheet. Now, what we're going to do is take one common chart called a bar chart, also known as a column chart, and just look at the different parts of that chart, just to help you understand what they're comprised of. Okay, so let's get started. Right, so we've got this table here, which is basically some sample dummy data of ice creams and the quantity sold by flavor. So from this table, I've basically generated a bar chart here, and I have annotated the various elements of this bar chart. Now folks, if you do want to know about how to make Excel tables, then please do check out our tutorials on that. But just bringing it back to our bar chart, we're going to go from the top left all the way to the top right. Okay, so when you generate your bar chart or any chart in Microsoft Excel, it will always be within what we call a chart box, which is basically this bit here. Now, this chart box, you can alter the appearance of it. For example, you can make the corners rounded, and you can also change the color of the actual border of the chart box, or you can actually remove it. Okay, so the next element we're going to look at is basically the y-axis label. Now, with a bar chart, you basically get your points of data plotted against a scale or an axis. So in this case, we've got our points of data here, which is basically our ice cream flavors, and our axis is here. Okay, so let's take a look at the next element, a y-axis label. So with a bar chart, you basically have data plotted against some sort of quantifiable measure. Now, we have two axes, basically the y-axis and the x-axis. So the y-axis is basically this bit here, and the x-axis is this bit here. Now folks, this is a 2D chart. If you do make a 3D chart, you will have an extra axis, which is basically the z-axis, which represents the sort of perspective or depth. Okay, so with our axes, you can label them. So in this case, quantity is our y-axis label. This is also known as a vertical axis label. Now, with regards to the scale, this scale is automatically generated by Microsoft Excel when you create your chart. You can adjust it. However, Microsoft Excel will basically determine the minimum value and the maximum value, and always give you a little bit more when it comes to the maximum value. So in this case, butterscotch has a number of 45. So Microsoft Excel is giving us 50. Now, again, you can adjust this, but it's beyond the scope of this tutorial. However, it can be done quite easily. And of course, if you do want to know about that specifically, please do leave a request in the comment section below. Okay, so the next element we've got are basically grid lines. Now, these chart grid lines enable you to read your data clearly. Now, you can have two types of grid lines, major grid lines and minor grid lines. In this instance, we're only seeing the major grid lines. The minor grid lines are basically lines where it will enable you to read in between your numbers. So for example, we've got 0, we've got 10. 5, which would be about here, if we wanted to add a grid line to that value, would be considered a minor grid line. Now, of course, folks, the more grid lines you have, it can sometimes have the opposite effect of making a chart less clearer. So again, as you make charts more and more, you'll get a sense of the grid lines itself and how it fits into the overall chart, and whether you need them or whether you need to adjust them. Now again, folks, in terms of grid lines, sometimes you can actually have an excess of grid lines, which can make your chart actually less clearer to read. Now, in terms of how do you know, well, it's really down to intuition and experience as you come to making more and more charts. Eventually, you'll gain a keen sense of what's making the chart clearer, and if that means that in some cases you have to remove the grid lines, then so be it. But it could also mean you might just have to adjust them. For example, the color of them, making them less intense, so that they gently enable you to read the values. Now folks, in terms of how do you know when to apply grid lines to a chart? Well, Microsoft Excel by default will include them. Now you can adjust the intensity of the grid lines and you can also remove them. However, it's down to your intuition and user preference, and also the type of chart you're making. Sometimes grid lines can make a chart actually more difficult to read because it basically can overload or overcrowd a chart if it's got too many elements already in it. However, this all again depends on the type of chart you're making and the actual data itself. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next component of our bar chart, and that is basically the items. So from our table here, basically it's graphically represented in our chart here. Now each item basically follows the structure like this. For each set of data, it's known as a series, and then after that you drill down to a point of data in that series, and then the value of that point in that series. So basically series, point, value. So in this case, our series is the number of ice cream sold, so our data set. Drilling within that, the point, so for example this one would be called vanilla, and the value of our vanilla is 25. Now if you move your mouse over a data point, you basically get this same structure in a data label. So as you can see, we're getting series, number of ice cream sold, point, vanilla, value 25. So let's take the next data point, which is series, number of ice cream sold, point, strawberry, value 30. So that's how the structure goes, folks, when it comes to how Microsoft Excel represents table data graphically via a chart. Okay, now the next component we're going to look at is the legend, which is basically the key. Now this enables you to describe what you're actually showing in your chart, and it's basically just, as it says, a key or a legend where it will match the same color that you've got and tell you what that data item with that color represents. So in this case, we've got the number of ice cream sold and the same color is matching. So if you read your chart, you know that all these data points basically are ice cream flavors, and this is being quantified as the number of ice cream sold per flavor. Okay. Now the next chart component is the x-axis label, which is also known as a horizontal axis label. So once we've generated our chart, we need to label our axes. So here we had quantity, and here it's simply called flavors. So when you're reading your bar chart, again, this helps to describe exactly what data you're representing. Now folks, I do appreciate the example we've taken of ice creams and flavors is very self-explanatory. However, there are going to be many more instances where you have to generate charts from tables of data where it's not so obvious. Hence, an x-axis label is always good to include in your chart. Now, the next bit is more of a description of the actual bar generation, and that is our chart bars. So if you're describing the chart, especially to an audience which isn't familiar with bar charts, then it's always good to somewhere include this in a description, even if it's in an email or a document or as part of a presentation, just to make it very crystal clear that the height of the bar represents the amount sold or whatever quantifiable measure you're using. Okay, and moving on to our final component, it's basically the chart title. Now, a chart title is sometimes an instance the first thing that a user will see after the actual chart itself when they look at it. So it's always good to include one and also make it meaningful. Okay, so that concludes our explaining of the components of a chart. Now folks, with Microsoft Excel charts, they are very flexible in terms of the components, what you can alter. So pretty much everything we've described can be altered in some way. Now this is great because it enables you then to create a presentation style keeping in mind the audience you're making it for. So that moves us on to the next bit, which is presenting a bar chart. Now folks, we do have videos which go into this a bit more in depth. I strongly suggest that if you want to know more about how to present a bar chart and how to know about the different styles, that you check out these videos. But we're just going to overview some brief concepts here. When you're presenting a bar chart, the number one thing to remember is that it's all about communication. And the goal is to make your end user understand your chart. Now, there are different things to consider. For example, colors, the medium in which the chart will be presented, for example, if it's on screen or if it's being printed, the style of document, the audience, and the actual data, whether it's good news or bad news. So all these factors go into how you're going to make your chart and present it. Now, as we've already mentioned before, all of these chart elements can be adjusted. So that's the good thing. Now, in terms of how do you know what to adjust and when to adjust, well, this comes through experience. And the best way to get this chart experience is to keep making charts as much as possible and adjust the various components of the charts. Okay, so that wraps up this Charts 101 lecture. We have overviewed the various components of a chart and explained a bit about each component. And we have also touched on some of the elements you need to factor in when presenting a bar chart. Now, folks, if you have any questions or queries, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And if you like these type of videos, please do consider subscribing to the channel and turning on that notification bell. And this video forms part of a bigger playlist on charts. So if you do want to know more about charts and have a structured way of learning them, please do check out our playlist, which runs you through all the videos in sequence. And if you want to learn more about beginners Excel, please check out our relevant playlist for that as well. Okay, so thank you for listening and watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Have a great day.